Marcus is a connoisseur of anything that's free, so he was happy to read the disclaimer on TurboTax Free Edition.
Roughly 37% of taxpayers qualify. Form 1040 and limited credits only. See how at TurboTax.com. That's me!
File your taxes 100% free with TurboTax Free Edition and get your max refund guaranteed. See if you qualify to file for free at TurboTax.com. See max refund guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, this is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine. Today's topic, the IEP 504 Checkup, are your child's accommodations set for the new school year. It's critical for every parent who has a child diagnosed with ADHD or learning disability. In many cases, a good IEP or 504 plan means the difference between your child being happy and successful in school or doing poorly and feeling miserable. We are very fortunate to have Susan Yellin with us today to give parents practical advice on how to make sure our kids get the best IEP and 504 plan for their needs. Susan is the Director of Advocacy and College Counseling Services at the Yellin Center for Mind, Brain, and Education, an innovative learning support and diagnostic practice in New York City. She co-authored the award-winning book, Life After High School, a guide for students with disabilities and their families. Susan will give some introductory remarks about IEPs and 504 plans. Then she will take your questions. Welcome, Susan.
Okay. The start of the school year is really a good time, just as you're buying notebooks and pencils and backpacks, to see where your child stands in terms of his or her accommodations for the new year. Whether your child has an IEP under the Individuals for Disabilities Education Act, or your child has a 504 plan under what everybody calls Section 504, but is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, your child's got a written plan that sets out what he or she needs for the school year in order to access his or her education and to be provided with those services he or she needs because of either an attention or a learning issue or both. So, first thing we need to do is to make sure that the folks who are responsible for providing the accommodations or services are aware of these plans. For kindergarten through 12th grade students, that means that a teacher needs to have a copy of the 504 plan or IEP. Now, that doesn't mean that each teacher, for example, for a middle or high school student, they may have 6 or 8 teachers. Doesn't mean that each teacher has to physically have their own copy. It means that that copy has to be available to teachers. Different schools and different districts do it in their own way. Sometimes it's kept in the guidance office. For elementary school, the teacher may indeed have a copy of it. But there is a misunderstanding. A lot of schools are concerned with federal privacy laws governing educational records. You may have heard them referred to as FERPA. FERPA is the Federal Education Records Privacy Act, but it does not mean that a child's 504 or IEP is such a secret document that the teacher doesn't see it. The teacher must see it and must have access to it. So the first thing you need to make sure as the school year begins is that your child's teacher has indeed obtained a copy of this or had a chance to study it, because without that, he or she won't know what it is your child needs and what your child is legally entitled to get to help that student through the school year. Now, it's a completely different world for college students, and if we have any college students or their parents listening, let me sort of jump in with a different set of laws that govern things. And that makes a difference in how you need to approach your accommodations for the school year. Because for college students, the law that governs is something called the Americans with Disabilities Act. Yes, it covers everybody, including elementary and high school students, but there are other laws that are more active there. For college students, the Americans with Disabilities Act says that you're entitled to accommodations but it's the responsibility of the student to make sure that those accommodations are in place. So if you're a new college student or a returning college student, you should have created with the College Office of Disability Services a document setting out what accommodations you're entitled to. For example, extended time on exams is a common one for students who have attention difficulties or learning difficulties. And then as a college student, you need to make sure that your professors are advised of these accommodations, and then that your professors actually follow those. For example, if there's a test announced, that you have the opportunity to take that test someplace other than in a crowded, noisy classroom where everybody is done ahead of you. So different rules apply, but the concept of making sure that all of your plans are in place at the beginning of the year applies to college students as well. It's important to know that there is a requirement in all of these laws that these plans be reviewed. So the season for this sort of thing tends to happen if your child has a 504 plan or an IEP. It's likely that you had a school meeting in the spring. That seems to be when these things happen. It's not universal. And let's say around May, you sat down, you reviewed the information from the entire school year, and you decided what your child would be needing for this coming school year, the one that's either begun or is about to begin, depending on where you live. Then, as this new school year, the 2014-2015 year goes by, you will be moving ahead with those accommodations in place, with those services in place. But it's important to know that you are not locked into this. So let's first look at how often you have to go back over this. So each year you should have revisited it. If you did not have a chance last spring or sometime over the summer to go over this plan, take a look at it, pull it out. Hopefully you keep files of these things, and see when it was last reviewed. If it's more than a year, you're overdue for a review. And it's time to contact the people on either the IEP team or the 504 team and tell them that your child is due for a review. And it's important to update these things. Children change over the years. The educational demands of different grades differ, and you need to know that your child's plan meets his or her needs. Likewise, if you're a college student and you're starting a new school year, that's the time to sit down with your disability services officer, see what worked in past semesters, or if you're just starting, what worked in high school, what software you may be using, what note-taking techniques have been helpful to you, and set up a new plan. So sort of as you're going through your parental mental checklist, or if you're an adult student, your own mental checklist, make sure that things have been reviewed recently, that they're up to date. For kindergarten through high school students, every 3 years you need a full reevaluation called a triennial review, and that's in time to kind of take a more global look at things. But every single year there should be a review to see what your child needs. It's important to also know that you're not limited to a once-a-year review. Both an IEP and a 504 plan are living documents, which means that you as a parent have the right to proceed to the school to contact them and say, look, we made up an IEP last spring. It seemed to be great. We started it in September, and it's not working. He needs more support. Or she's getting language services 3 times a week, and she really needs them less because she doesn't like being pulled out of class, and if she does, her language is better. Likewise, a college student who's been given time and a half for exams, extra time, time and a half. Maybe you really feel that that's not enough. Maybe you want to discuss whether you can have the exams in a quiet location, or maybe you need double time and you can show documentation and evidence that this is necessary. For students with IEPs, There is not a need to call a new IEP meeting, which I know parents feel is a big burden on the school and on them. It can be done by a written agreement if it's a small change. So there's no need to call a new meeting for a small change in an IEP. 504 has to be done in writing also to make changes, but it can be done fairly easily if it's a small change. If you need a new meeting, then call the meeting. It's your right to have the opportunity to share your views with the people who are making up these plans for your child. Sometimes you might want to even bring your child into, depending on their age and their disability, to explain why something isn't working. And that can be very powerful and very helpful. But don't be under the misimpression that simply because you set up a plan last spring or you're going to be setting something up in September, for example, that you're locked into it for a full year. You are not. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Be polite but firm and explain that you need to make some changes. And as I said, college accommodations are also not locked in. And because the nature of different courses will change, for example, 1 year a student may be taking introductory courses, and there's a lot of lectures, and there's a lot of large classes. The accommodations a student may need in that circumstance may be different from an upperclassman who has laboratories or small tutorials where things, and lots of papers. And remember, no college is required to change their standards or to modify their curriculum. No law requires that, and no college will do it for you. But the accommodations needed to access the curriculum, to access the small group seminars, to access a large lecture, are things that you can have made easier for you. And that's what's important there. Now, I've thrown a lot of things at you because there are a lot of moving parts. We're talking about 2 different age cohorts here, children from kindergarten through 12, and then another separate set of issues for students who are in school but who are in college or postgraduate programs. And then we're talking about 3 different laws. The IDEA, which gives us our IEP, which is for children from K to 12, Section 504 as it applies to children from K to 12, and then for college students, primarily the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I hope I haven't been too confusing. And Wayne, I think we're ready for questions.
Yes. So Marcy asks, our current teacher says an IEP or 504 is not necessary because she would make the needed accommodations anyway. She's great. I love her, but I would still be more comfortable if one was in place. Is the school being negligent by not writing a 504 for my child?
Well, I have to tell you, Marcy, that a lot of parents do decide when they have a terrific teacher and everything's working well to forego the 504 or the IEP for that year. It's always a risk. Teachers come and go, people go out on leave, and then you're not left with a track record of what your child requires. So although it might work, and it has worked for many families I know, I always say, get your plan in place, and then this terrific teacher can take that plan and make the most of it. Now, the school does have to at least consider a 504 plan or an IEP if you believe that your child qualifies for it. Sometimes the school may disagree with the parent as to whether or not the student qualifies, and then the fallback position is, well, the teacher can accommodate the child. But if your child indeed qualifies, and the qualifications are different for an IEP and a 504, and if parents have questions about that, I can go into that, but I won't go down that road this second. But if your child does indeed qualify, I would gently push them, remind them that you do have the right to have your child considered for one of these educational plans, and you'd be more comfortable to create the track record. This is especially important if your child is in high school or even upper middle school. And the reason for that is if he or she will be taking SAT or ACT exams, what those testing organizations want to look at is the track record of that student having formal accommodations and using them. And in fact, without that, it's very unlikely that he or she will be given extended time or any other testing accommodations on the SAT or ACT exams. So with a different answer in some ways, if we're talking about a first grader and maybe he or she hasn't had academic challenges which are sufficient to make it clear whether or not he needs services. But if you've got a student in middle school or heading into high school, absolutely you want a written plan so you can use that to create a track record and a record of accommodations that you can use when you take college entrance exams.
Very good advice. Rebecca has a question. How can I add to my son's 504 plan something to protect him from being shamed in class? Or can I?
Well, first of all, and there was an interesting series of questions about this in the Attitude magazine. If you can track back, I had a column asking almost that question. First of all, I assume that you've spoken to the teacher. I assume that you've spoken to the principal. But really what's happening is either the teacher is doing the shaming or the other children are doing what could be considered bullying of the child. There are anti-bullying statutes in place in a number of states, and you may want to do some internet searching on that for your state. But I think that what's really going on here is if your child has a disability that qualifies him or her for a 504 plan, and the teacher, let's assume it's the teacher, and again, I'm making an assumption here. If the teacher is shaming him or her, then the teacher is actually violating that child's civil rights because 504 is a civil rights law. And I'm going to read to you from the law, if I may. Sorry, guys. I know people find law boring. But no individual with a disability shall be subjected to discrimination by reason of his or her disability. That's straight from the law. So what's happening is if the teacher is shaming a child because, let's say, he's the last one finished on every exam because his attention wanders, that teacher is actually discriminating. Think about it if a teacher were mocking a child for a racial characteristic or an ethnic characteristic. That would not be permitted. But to do it because a child has a disability, the way to handle this is to, if you've spoken to the teacher and you've spoken to the principal, to go back to the principal, one bite at the apple for the teacher should be enough, and say, look, this is not okay. And if necessary, we will be looking to file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education, and then do it. You can go online, United States Department of Education, Section 504, and you don't have to be a great internet searcher to figure out what office you file a complaint with, and file a federal complaint. Then nobody in the school is going to be too happy about it, but it's the only way to protect your child.
Lisa asks, she's had accommodations for her son in middle and high school, and her son is heading off to college within a year. And she says, how does all of this work? What should I do? Is there anything I should do to make sure that these accommodations are extended to college, or is it a whole new process?
Yes, it's a whole new process. I hate to tell you, I wrote a whole book about this, so I'm going to try to take that and bring it down to a short answer. But first of all, what went on in high school is relevant but nowhere near controlling. Of course, I'm assuming that you've looked for a college that has a good Office of Disability Services, not some small, they all have to have one by law, by the way, but you don't want one with a little tiny room stuck in a basement somewhere. You want to, when you look at the college, you want to meet these people ahead of time and just get a feel for the services they offer. Then, after your child has decided what school to attend, been accepted, and you send in your deposit, the next step you need to do is to contact the Office of Disability Services, and almost all of them have a special section in the website. Just search for students with disabilities on the college website. The office will pop up, and they generally have forms that you can actually fill out online or print out and send in that go along with your documentation. K-12 schools, they have to do your evaluation. They have to evaluate you, not so in college. If you have a recent evaluation from high school, they will accept that, but it generally has to be within 3 years. They will take that evaluation, or you can go get a private evaluation, and they will look and see what your test scores were, how much time do you need, that sort of thing. Then when you first get to campus, you make an appointment, you bring in this documentation if you haven't submitted it already, and you sit down with your disability services officer. You'll be assigned one, and it's a discussion. I see here, Tommy, that you had a time and a half for all your exams in high school. How did that work out? It worked out pretty well. Do you think that's enough, Tommy? Yes, I think that's enough. Okay, let's put that on your list. What about note-taking, Tom? Do you think you need that? We have services of note-takers, or we can get you copies of the notes from your professors. Has either one of those been helpful to you before? And it's a back and forth, going through a list of all the possible accommodations that Tommy would need for his particular disability. Then the student gets a document from the Office of Disability Services outlining the results of this discussion. Believe it or not, that's only step one. That same Office of Disability Services creates a shorter form for each of Tommy's professors. Now note that the professors do not have to know what Tommy's disability is unless Tommy chooses to share that. The Disability Services Office has to know. They've got documentation of what the disability is. But the forms that go to the professors simply say, Tom Jones is entitled to time and a half on each exam and a quiet exam location. You introduce yourself to the professor at the beginning of the first or second class. Hi, my name is Tom, Professor. I've got this form from the Disability Services Office. If I'm going to be taking an exam, I need to take it in a separate location. Professor says, fine, Tom, when I announce the exams, remind me. Usually the Disability Services Office needs some lead time. Now the logistics of this stuff is very fluid. What about pop quizzes? Some students choose to just take them in class with disastrous results. Some take them in class with great results. Some speak to the professor, privately, and they work something else out. It's very complicated because college professors really don't have this stuff first on their mind. But a student who is willing to seek help from the Office of Disability Services, a student who's willing to go to the professor, introduce themselves, share the fact that they have accommodations, and remembers to give the form to the professor and to stay on top of the syllabus so they know when exams are coming up, can make this work. But it's not easy, especially for kids with executive function or anxiety or attention problems. These all make this harder. So it's not simple. I don't usually tout my book, but please, it's really inexpensive on Amazon. You can get a Kindle version. And take a look at the chapters that deal with actually, I think it's chapter 12 or something, putting it all together. How do you, just what I've spoken about, how do you physically get from this position where you've got the right to the accommodation to putting it into play in the lecture hall?
Yes, Sandra is asking, I am applying for accommodations for my son. How much better is an IEP than a 504 plan? He has issues with writing and composing sentences of what he has read. Is this enough to get an IEP?
It might be. Sandra, the real key is that for an IEP, which I tend to prefer for students who qualify, you need to not just have one of a list of, I think it's 13 classifications of disability, which includes things like learning disability, which would be the sort of the key to open the door for your child services. But the language says something along the lines of such that the child requires special education. So if the issues are very mild, he or she might not qualify for an IEP. If the issues are more pervasive and really do impact learning, then chances are he or she would qualify for an IEP. Now, why do I like an IEP better? Because not every state requires parental participation in 504 teams. Some do, but not all of them. It's not required by the law. I like the IEP. If you've ever looked at an IEP, they can run on for 10 or 12 pages easily. Now, mind you, many of them are computer generated. They're not always the most thoughtfully, laid out documents, but they do consider what your child's goals are in every area. They're much more extensive. A 504 plan can be one page. Johnny gets time and a half on every test. They don't lay things out. They're not as analytical. I don't think that if you can qualify for an IEP that you should accept a 504. So I think what you need to do to get this started is you go to your school and you request in writing, you advise them that you suspect your child has a learning disability, you would like to have your child evaluated for this learning disability, and they have 60 days to complete that from the time you consent to such evaluation. At that point, they will report back to you, and they will say either we don't believe he qualifies, or yes, we think that he fits within one of the definitions under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we believe that he is entitled to an IEP, an individualized educational program, and let's hold a meeting and we'll pull one together. So if you try for an IEP, 504 can be a fallback plan. And the reason that some schools are reluctant to give IEPs is they do have to report to the federal government how many children are classified, but there's also some funding under IDEA. 504 doesn't require them to report numbers in the same way, and it also doesn't require them to get funding. So different districts, different states have different perspectives, but I would recommend that if you believe that he has a learning disability or it's attention significant enough to impact his learning, that you go for your IEP.
A lot of parents have asked about whether behavior, which causes some of their children to not, gets in the way of learning in the classroom, is covered by an IEP or a 504 plan. They seem to be getting some resistance from schools that say basically an IEP and 504 plan don't cover behavior issues. Yet that's the main thing that's getting in the way of their children doing well. So what are your thoughts?
Well, it's complicated. I wish I had an easy answer. One of the things that you do not want to do is there is a classification under IDEA of emotional disturbance. Now, that's a really significant, it requires an inability to learn, an inability to maintain satisfactory relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate behaviors or feelings, pervasive mood of unhappiness, physical symptoms like school avoidance because of, stomach aches and things. But it has to be over a long period of time to a marked degree and has to adversely affect the student's educational performance. But that's really something you may not want to go for. That can really impact a student's perception and even the kinds of programs that would have that student participate. So if your child indeed has an emotional disturbance, then that's clearly something that you should be appropriately categorized and dealt with. But if it's simply an attention-based, for example, a kid with significant ADHD, so that's attention with a hyperactivity aspect, who can't sit still, who blurts things out, who disrupts class, that child may not be emotionally disturbed, simply have significant attention that causes behavioral consequences. That child should probably be getting an IEP based on a category called OHI, Other Health Impaired. That specifically includes attention that impacts a child's learning. Now, how do you get that when the teacher's saying, but he's just misbehaving? I firmly believe that when kids misbehave, it's for a reason. Let me give you some examples. If a student, for example, has a language problem, they can't process language that's coming in, it's going to be, or can't express themselves, they have an expressive language difficulty. That student is not going to behave in typical ways because he or she can't express themselves. Remember the expression we all use as parents, use your words? Well, if he or she can't use their words because words are hard to come by, that child's going to behave poorly. Yet the problem is not emotional disturbance. The problem is that the child needs an IEP to deal with the expressive or receptive language difficulty. Likewise, a child with significant attention who is behaving poorly because they have this attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that child, you as a parent may want to consult with a good physician to see what other options are available outside of school. But the fact remains that that child should be getting an IEP based on their attention. Yes, there are behavioral aspects to it, but that's part of managing the ADHD. So I guess if you have a kid who's, simply poorly behaved, then maybe it's possible that the school's position that these laws don't govern is a legitimate one. But I would think that what your parents should do in that circumstance is first start with a really good evaluation. Our office does evaluations privately, and what we often find is that there's an underlying reason, a diagnosis, that can explain many of the behaviors that parents and schools see. And once you can tease out that kind of behavior and the reasons for it based in neurological, neuropsychological, and educational bases, then you can start putting together ways to handle it, strategies to mitigate it, possibly medications to help with it, but the eye therapies. But just to say that the kid is poorly behaved so we can't deal with this, I think is irresponsible on the part of the school. Maybe there are rotten kids out there, but most of them have reasons for their poor behavior. I wouldn't be so quick to just say, oh, he's ill-behaved and stop there.
There are many questions about IEPs or 504 plans that aren't working. Teachers, parents, everyone get in the room, they write it up, they think at the time that it's going to work for their child, but they find out over the months that it doesn't. So parents want to know how they can change it to make, to better address their child's needs. Do they have to wait for the annual review? Can they do something sooner?
They can definitely do something sooner. I made some mention of that in my introductory remarks, but let me repeat it. The school has to revisit it once a year. That's at the minimum, but there's no prohibition. In fact, there are rules about how to do it. You can go in between. In fact, you should. I would give it a little time to work. So if it was done, let's say, last spring, I wouldn't go in the first week of school if things are a little rocky. But if by a month in, things are not working and you can see that this IEP, let's use an IEP as an example, but a 504, it's the same concept. If you see it's not working, you contact the head of the IEP team. You say, look, we need to either make this small tweak if you as a parent know exactly what it is you want. Let's say you want to add another session of speech and language therapy, or you feel your child needs math assistance as well as reading assistance, or something that's pretty basic and can just be agreed upon then you do not have to hold a meeting. But you can always convene an IEP meeting upon the parent's request. And if the school says no, the school is wrong. You have the right to go back in. You do not have to wait a year. And you absolutely can convene a meeting, explain your concerns, and ask that they be addressed and that the IEP be modified.
That's good advice and something I didn't know. Another parent asks about her 14-year-old son who has ADD. He was, I don't know the proper term, but he was released from his IEP last year as his grades were too good. During winter break, though, he had a bout with OCD, and I would like to have a 504 plan to help him to complete his work. Can I go back, even though he had an IEP?
Absolutely you can. The expression would be, or the terminology is, children who get IEPs are classified. In other words, they fit into one of these definitions or categories. They're classified in a classification, and when a student is deemed to no longer need IEP services, they become declassified. So what you have here is a student who's doing well academically, but who has emotional or behavioral issues that need to be addressed. That's a good candidate for a 504 plan. And as I said in the beginning of this discussion, these laws were all developed at different points in time for different reasons. So the students, and there's no reason why you can't be pursuing a 504 plan whether or not you've had an IEP. So the mother should contact the school and say, my child is having difficulties. He has a disability. I assume that there's a written diagnosis by a physician of OCD. And, of course, there still remains the ADD. That doesn't disappear. My child has these issues. We need to get a plan in place to enable him to do his work and to succeed in school. Can we have a 504 plan, please? And this is what it should include. So, yes, the answer is absolutely. 504 plan sounds like a good approach.
Yes. Nicomo asks, how do you suggest getting the College Board to provide accommodations for kids who have IEPs? We've tried to get accommodations for a couple of years and are always denied.
Oh, I'm sighing because I just spent the morning working with a family who had the same problem. This is not an uncommon thing. As I'm sure you know, if you've dealt with the College Boards, there is a whole section of their website which is designed to give information to individuals with disabilities who are seeking accommodations. So the first thing that they're going to want, and I assume you've given them up-to-date documentation, you've shared with them the IEP. Sometimes if a child is in a school that has a special relationship with the College Board, and there's a designation that I can't recall the name of, but these are schools that actually have, the school will serve as a conduit for the family to get accommodations, but presumably your school doesn't have this arrangement with them, then, and you've submitted the documentation on your own, clearly they've examined it. I assume that you've appealed it. They say that the appeal process takes about 7 weeks. I find it takes a little longer. It can be arbitrary. It is very difficult to figure out. They do give you a reason for turning you down, but it's difficult to then, on appeal, get that overturned. It's rare to have an appeal be successful. I'm not saying it's not successful. What they'll do is they'll turn you down. They'll say, well, the documentation doesn't show evidence that he or she was getting extended time in school or that he or she needs extended time. But if you've been fighting with them for 2 years and you haven't been successful, I'm not sure what I have to add. I do note that, of course, there's the ACT exam, which has its own rules and its own requirements and is not any easier, but at least there are different people looking at the information. There's also the possibility of bypassing this entire difficult system completely. There's an organization that has a website. The organization is called FAIRTEST, FAIRTEST, and their website is fairtest.org. And it's a good starting point for learning about the 800 or so colleges that do not require SAT or ACT exams for admittance. They may require them for placement. They may require them for students who are homeschooled when they don't have grades or other things. But for most students, they don't require ACTs and SATs for admittance. There's some really good schools on that list. And it's very likely that you may decide to take that route. But it's tough. The testing organizations are governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Even if you have a child who's getting accommodations under IDEA or 504, the testing organizations are governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is a section in my book about that, but very importantly, you can also access information. I have a blog. My website is www.yellincenter.com, Y-E-L-L-I-N center.com. Click at the blog link and then search SAT exams. There's something like 800 blogs there, so I wouldn't even know where to tell you to start. But there's a number of blogs written about SATs, ACTs, and how to get accommodations. That's a good free way to get some information beyond what I'm telling you now.
Mm-hmm. As long as I've been working here at Attitude, I've had questions almost weekly about what happens when you've written up the IEP and the 504 plan, and the first month the teacher, executes the accommodations, but then you go in 3 months later only to find out that some of them are not being used. Parents want to know what they can do. A lot of them are just plain angry since they spent all this time with the school coming up with the accommodations. So I'm sure anger is not going to solve anything, but I am curious about the process that a parent can take when he or she finds out that the accommodation is not being carried out.
It's a very frequent question that I hear as well. I agree with you. Anger doesn't solve anything. Throw something in your own house and then go into a meeting and bring cookies. You do catch more flies with honey. I'm convinced of that. And I can get very upset with schools, but I really do try to keep my temper. And one good way to do that, by the way, is to have somebody come with you to a meeting who can kick you in the ankle when you start to get agitated. I'm a parent. I have a child who's struggled in school, and I've cried at plenty of CESE meetings. So I've been there, folks, and I know this. But, okay, let's get concrete. What can you do? First thing you do is you're going to go up the chain of command. You're going to start with the teacher. You're going to bring in a copy of the IEP in a very collegial, non-accusatory way. Mrs. Smith, here's Johnny's IEP. I notice that this isn't happening. If we're talking about things in the classroom. If it's more global, let's say Johnny's supposed to get reading support or a math pullout or speech and language, then you're going to either go to the head of the guidance department, the IEP chair, or the principal, depending on how things are done in your school. You're going to bring the IEP. You're going to possibly bring some evidence. For example, maybe keep track on your home calendar when Johnny gets pulled out, or maybe sometimes things happen. I mean, you'll have let's say speech and language. A speech and language teacher goes out on maternity leave, and they can't find a replacement. Stuff happens, and we all have to work with it. We push, but we understand that teachers are individuals, schools have personnel problems, so try to be understanding. But if the problem persists and the school really isn't cooperating, and you've gone to the teacher, you've gone to the principal, you've possibly gone one level up to the district level, so that some large districts have a district head of IEPs, or the district head of guidance for maybe 3 or 4 schools, and none of that works in a collegial fashion, then you need to advise the district by letter that please note that it's come to our attention that our son's IEP has not been followed in the following ways. You can list the 2 or 3 ways he's not getting the services he was that he's supposed to be getting, or the services are not being given in an appropriate fashion, or whatever else the problem is. We have attempted to resolve this by speaking to the teacher, to the principal, to the IEP team head, lay it out, not a saga, just almost like a bulleted list. Unless this matter is resolved to our satisfaction and he receives those items to which he is entitled, it will be necessary for us to seek legal representation to effectuate, I love that word, to effectuate the terms of his IEP. Very truly yours. And then you're going to follow through. You're going to see if you can find a local special ed attorney. Good place to do that. There's an organization called COPA, C-O-P-A-A, Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. They have people in every state. They have a website where you can look up attorneys and advocates in your area, copa.org, www.copaa.org. These are people who just work on the kids and family side of special education. They're not in this to get rich. That doesn't mean that they won't charge you, but if you can possibly afford a consultation, you may get some concrete advice. In addition, there are local agencies that will do this stuff pro bono or on a sliding scale. And you will advise them that your child's IEP is not being followed. You have taken every step you can as a parent, and you are at your wit's end. And they can actually file a hearing with a state hearing officer to compel the district to follow the IEP. Chances are it won't get to that point, but sometimes the district just digs in their heels. But you do have, under the IDEA, parents do have the right to seek a hearing before a state hearing officer when their child's not having his or her needs met.
Here's one that can be addressed quickly, I think. One, Gwen asks, I have heard that if your child doesn't have a 504 plan by high school, she won't get one. Is that true?
No. But what is true, Gwen, you can get a 504 plan at any point in time. But what you may have misunderstood is that if you take that question and you pull it out a little, which is if my child hasn't gotten a 504 plan by high school, he or she is less likely to get accommodations on the SATs or ACTs, then that is true. Because they want to see a track record of your child having accommodations and needing them and using them. So, you know, if you have a high school junior or a senior who finds the workload has just gotten to be too much and really, you know, let's say someone who's had a low-level attention problem has been managing, and as they're getting into AP courses and things are getting more complicated, they really do need extended time. There's no reason not to seek a 504 plan, but just understand is that the one thing that makes the college testing exam folks very suspicious is someone who suddenly develops the need for extended time as a high school junior. Makes them scratch their heads, and they're not likely to take that seriously as an individual needing accommodations.
Rachel asks, my daughter had an ISP. I don't even know what an ISP is.
I do, and I'll explain that.
From her private school last year. Is the public school she's going to this year bound by that ISP? It's
yes, but if your daughter moved from the private school to the public school, she's really, what she's gotten, an IESP, it's an Individualized Educational Services Plan. And children who the IDEA runs, the rights in it run to each student, and it applies to students whether or not they're in public or private school. And that brings up a good point, by the way, not to get off topic, but 504 only applies to public schools. Children in private schools cannot get a 504. 504 is based on the fact that the school district is getting funding from the federal government. All public schools do in one form or fashion, directly or indirectly. Private schools do not. So they call it an Individualized Educational Services Plan because the services are provided generally by an agency hired by the school district to come into the private school and provide those services. If your child is moving from a private school where he or she has an IESP into a public school, the nature of the services, the way that they're given is going to change. So you absolutely should convene a meeting of your child's IEP team, and the location of that may change too. It's a long saga I won't go into, but the team is based upon where the school is located and where you reside. Presumably, where you reside and where the school is located is the same if your child is in public school. It may not be the same if your child is in private school. Maybe you send them to a private school in the next district. So you should reconvene a meeting promptly upon the transfer of your child to the public school, because the kinds of services are different. You'll find in most cases that your child will be getting richer services, more services in the public school.
Tiffany has a question. Should my child's IEP contain specific goals they hope to obtain, or just a general overview of additional services they will be given during school?
You said an IEP? An
Yes.
IEP, it should be extremely detailed. It should break things down into, it should list the services, but it should also list goals, so that if, for example, a child has a reading problem, it should specify that the child will be meeting with a reading teacher on these many times a week, in this either individually or more likely in a group of not more than 3 children. But it will also include, he will learn to identify certain vocabulary, he will learn to complete sentences, very specific goals to identify words, to be able to read at this particular level. So the goals are very, very, very specific. Almost too specific, because they're all computer generated. Sometimes they lack a little humanity. But just setting out services is an insufficient IEP.
And are there also, you might have just said that, I'm sorry, time frames on when they're supposed to achieve their goals?
Well, during an IEP is a year's plan. Now, as I said, we can go back in and change that. But it's generally so that, let's say it's set up at the end of the year for the following school year, so that it's talking about during the term of the IEP, Johnny will learn to identify these many new vocabulary words, or Johnny will learn to read this kind of sentence, or something of that nature. So it's generally set up for a year. And then progress reports will indicate how Johnny is doing. Is he making progress towards the goal? If at the end of the year he hasn't made real progress, generally they look at something like 80% of the time. So if Johnny makes real progress and can achieve those goals, that's fine. If we're halfway through or 3/4 of the way through the year and Johnny's really not doing this very well at all, clearly those goals are not, either the goals aren't right or the services aren't sufficient or something's amiss. And I wouldn't wait till the end of the year to address that.
Is it best when applying for accommodations to have a formal diagnosis and letter and recommendations for school accommodations in hand before you apply?
Yes, absolutely. For 504, for example, the form I'm most familiar with is a New York City form. It requires that the doctor, the child's physician or psychologist or whoever, fill it out with a diagnosis, a discussion of what the child needs because of that diagnosis. It's a simple form. It's a page or two, but most districts have a form like that they use. So it's part of, in fact, if you are going to be meeting with your child, let's say pediatrician, because you believe he has attention difficulties, I would go online, see if you can find your district form and bring it to the pediatrician and have him or her fill it out for you, and then go to the school.
A lot of parents whose kids have switched from public school to charter schools have questions. Charter schools, is it true that charter schools are not required to follow an IEP 504?
Charter schools, now I'm going to speak in my limited knowledge as a New York attorney, and if for those in other states, the situation may be different. But here in New York, charter schools are public schools. They can be run by private companies, but they are public schools. They are required to follow a 504 or an IEP, and in fact, here in New York City, they're required to accept children who need a 504 or an IEP, and they can't discriminate against them. Now, does that mean that there's not problems with that? Yeah, there are problems. Some schools, charter schools, aren't set up to give these children what they need. So I'd be cautious, and some are, by the way, some are great, but I would be cautious about putting your child in a charter school without making sure that the school can provide services for your child. But here in New York, at least, a charter school is a public school and is bound by the requirements of other public schools.
One last question that I'd like to fit in. What is the time frame to file a federal complaint on a teacher? Is there a time limit to that?
I'm sure there is, but I don't know it off the top of my head, and I wouldn't want to remember incorrectly. But when you're talking about filing a complaint against a teacher, if you're talking about, you'd really have to be more specific, because unless you're filing a claim that the teacher has discriminated against your child, but failure to simply follow an IEP doesn't give the grounds for a complaint against a teacher. It would really be a civil rights claim of discrimination. And then in that case, it wouldn't just be the teacher. It would probably be the teacher, the school. Question is, did the school know, or should they have known that this was going on? It gets to be very complicated. I'd recommend if you're considering filing a complaint, you can check the statute of limitations by looking it up on a search engine. But more importantly, I might want to speak to a special ed attorney to discuss the nuances of it and the financial repercussions, positive and negative, of this sort of thing.
Okay, well, Susan, we'll have to end it there. Thanks for all the great insights and takeaways about IEPs and 504 plans. You've given us a lot of action steps to take, which have been great.
My pleasure. So, parenting is not easy stuff.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye now.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.